I know that we've been locked down for a while now, and I'm sure some of us have forgotten what it's like to travel. I was remembering this week about a time when I was in New South Wales and I had the opportunity to go to Jenolan Caves. If we ever do get out of the state, it's a place that I would recommend going. Jenolan Caves are about 3 hours west of Sydney, and they're a cave formation, rock formation that's been a tourist attraction really for a very long time. Well, I went there and I was bored with just the public caves that everyone could do, so I signed up for the adventure tour where they donned overalls and we had hard hats and the torches on our heads as we got to do proper caving, sort of scrambling around in the squeezy bits and finding out all the extent of the caves. At one point, as we were far back in the cave, the guide asked us all to stand with our back against the wall. We were in a bit of a large cavernous cave at the time. And so we all stood with our backs to the wall, and then he said, right, everyone is now going to turn off their torches. He said, we're going to leave our torches off for 60 seconds so that our eyesight can fully adjust to the light or the dark. And then he said, I want you to look to see if you can see any light. He said, some people can seem to think that they can see light. Some people think they can't. I want you to make your own decision. Well, I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm quite competitive. So I was determined if there was light to be seen, then I would see it. Now, he said, now, one of the reasons why I've stood you against the wall, he said, if there is light to be seen, it's definitely not behind you. So he said, I don't want you moving around while there's no light on in here. Obviously, we don't want to bump into each other. So he said, keep your feet still, keep your back up against the cave wall so you know where you are, but just look forward. Okay, so I was ready. So all the torches were turned off and it was pitch black. But I thought, you know, my eyes are just adjusting and I'm staring into the darkness going, if there's light here, I'm going to see it. I thought maybe there might be some glowworms. I've seen glowworms in caves in New Zealand before. Or I thought maybe there was some cracks in the ceiling somewhere where somehow maybe some light was penetrating from up above. So I stared and I was determined to see any light. And as I was watching, I could kind of see like some flashes of light in the corner of my eyes. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. And I wasn't sure if it was the glowworms and I kept missing them. So then I'd look at that spot and then I'd see a flash over there and I'd look. But they were so tiny that I wasn't sure if I was definitely seeing things. The 60 seconds passed and we all turned our lights back on. And the guide said, who thinks they saw lights? And I kind of went, I didn't want to say yes, definitely, because I definitely hadn't. And I didn't want to say I hadn't in case, you know, they were there. I didn't want to admit that I'd missed them. So I was kind of very tentative in my response. Looking around the room, probably 50–60% of people said, yeah, maybe we think we saw light. He said actually that the cave that we'd stopped in is actually the deepest point in the whole of the Jenolan cave system. And he said absolutely 100% categorically, there is zero light down here. But he explained then that there's a phenomenon with human eyes where in the same way that our eyes pick up blind spots and that we have a blind spot and we think that we can see things. I don't know if you've ever done the test where you can make your finger disappear. If you move your finger just into your blind spot. Well, he said, because we are so addicted to light, because our eyes want to see all the time, and because in our normal lives we're basically never in complete darkness, he said we as humans are looking for light, and so our brain imagines light, our brain imagines flashes, because it can't cope with the idea of being in permanent darkness. Permanent darkness. That reminds me of our story today. We all look for light. Light is a mega theme in the Bible. It starts right from the beginning in Genesis chapter 1, where the first words out of God's mouth are, let there be light. And we're not just talking about the sun there to create the light, because the sun is not created until day 4. We're talking about a sense of light that seems to just come from God, be part of who God is. And then light weaves its way all the way through the biblical narrative. And the Bible finishes with a reference to light as well in Revelation chapter 22, where it talks about the New Jerusalem as a place where we won't need the sun because the light of God is the light of the city. So definitely the idea that God is light is so interwoven with the whole of the scriptures. We're set up to the idea that there's going to be some sort of miracle relating to light in the previous chapter. In John chapter 8, we have the famous verse, "I am the light of the world." It's actually a line that Jesus says multiple times in his ministry, but there it's recorded in John chapter 8. Now you might remember Jose did a series a couple of months ago where we looked at salt and light, and there the text that he referred to in Matthew chapter 5 talked about, "You are the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world." That's actually the exception. In all other instances in the Bible, it's God that is referred to as the light of the world. We are there to be the mini lights, which is what the great calling is, that as Christians we're called to reflect God into the world. It's an amazing calling. So here we are. Jesus is the light of the world. He's right here, and he comes across a person who is blind. So that's the background and the context. And let's just go into the passage and read it. So, John chapter 9, if you have your Bibles there. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. When I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "and wash in the pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and washed. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He's a prophet." They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one that you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" "We know he is our son," the parents answered, "and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who had already decided that anyone who acknowledged Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That is why his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." A second time, they summoned the man who had been blind. "Give glory to God by telling the truth," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." He replied, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I've told you already and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to be his disciples too?" Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he has opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You've now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." Then the man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshipped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." Curing blindness is the most common miracle that Jesus does. And I think the main reason for that is because it was clearly foretold that the Messiah would open the eyes of the blind. It's referenced multiple times in the prophet Isaiah. So these people who were looking for the coming of the Messiah, they were looking for these signs. And one of the signs clearly is that the blind can see, the lame can walk, the deaf can hear. You know, these are famous passages in Isaiah. So remember when we talked about a couple of weeks ago, we talked about John chapter 20, verse 31. This is the point of the book of John. I'll just remind you what it says. It says, "These things are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." So John's building a case here. He's trying to say Jesus is the Messiah. And so if he's trying to demonstrate that Jesus is the Messiah, he must have references to what we knew that the Messiah was going to do by what was foretold in the prophets. One of the most striking things about this story is the fact that Jesus uses mud to do the healing. It's something that grossed me out the first time I came across this story. Why can't Jesus just speak and heal him like everyone else? Why does Jesus have to do something that's so dirty, so unhygienic? Now we live in a time of ultra cleanliness with COVID. You would never ever let someone spit in the dirt and rub the mud on your face. You would be, "Oh, no, get away from me." It's a horrible, visceral image. And yet, do you remember how when we talked the other couple of weeks ago, I mentioned that sometimes we see references in the New Testament stories that are a mirror or a reflection of an original story that happened in the Old Testament? Well, if I was to ask you, where in the Bible have you seen that before? A time that God puts his hands in the mud. Can you think of a time when that's happened before in the Bible? Well, hopefully you're thinking about the creation of man, when God made Adam in the first place. And I actually think that this is a really visual and graphic metaphor to remind people that this is Jesus he's creating. And in this instance, he's recreating a man born blind who wasn't created perfect in the first place because he'd lived with this condition his whole life. Jesus comes in as the ultimate creator and takes the mud and recreates this man. It's a beautiful image of being born again. So we have that reference, but then there's another reason too why mud matters in this story. Now, you may remember about a year ago or so, Jose preached a sermon on the importance of Sabbath and what Sabbath or Sabbathing was all about. And one of the things we learned in that series was that the Pharisees at the time of Jesus had created hundreds of rules that people had to follow. They turned the Sabbath into a list of do's and don'ts, and you must do this and you mustn't do this, and if you did this you were a sinner, and if you didn't do this you were a sinner. And they'd taken all the joy out of a day that was supposed to be a day of rest, a day of celebration, a day of peace, a day of reconnection with God. Well, one thing we learnt when we learnt about Sabbathing was that the Pharisees had created all these rules, as I just mentioned. And actually, one of the Pharisees' rules was no spitting. Now, you might think, well, why? What's wrong with spitting on the Sabbath? Now, spitting any other day of the week was fine, but on the Sabbath, it was outlawed. The reason for that is that your spit might roll downhill, and that might create a little puddle of mud, and making mud on the Sabbath was definitely work and therefore definitely not allowed. And so spitting was banned. And actually, it's quite interesting to see as we go through the story, the fact that the Pharisees are quite obsessed with this idea of mud and breaking the Sabbath. They're more angry about the fact that Jesus created mud than they are about anything else in this story. Okay, so we're going to look again through the passage, and we're going to look at two specific things now. We're going to look at the journey that the blind man took, and then we're also going to contrast that with the responses of the Pharisees. So if we start again at the beginning of the story, and if you have your Bibles, it's really useful to follow along, because then you'll be able to see the bits that I'm referring to. You can see at the beginning that this is not a man that runs to Jesus and says, please heal me, please heal me. In fact, he does nothing at all at the beginning. Jesus sees a man born blind, and he just goes, makes the mud, rubs it on his eyes, and he sends him off. It's another miracle that's done in absentia, rather than Jesus being physically present when someone is healed. So we know nothing about this man at this point, except for the fact that he'd been born blind. That's all we know. And then he comes back and he can see, and there's this really interesting passage around, is he the same man? Is he not the same man? Some people said he was, some of the neighbors said he wasn't. There was confusion, and the man, this is the first time he speaks. He's like, yeah, it's me. But it's almost like everyone's talking over him because they're so busy trying to work out what's happened and what's going on that they're not paying any attention to this man at all. And so eventually they say, well, what happened to you? And the man says, well, this man that they called Jesus, he made some mud, he put it on my eyes, he told me to go to Siloam, he told me to wash. So I went and I washed, and then I could see. Where is this man? They asked him. That's verse 12. He says, I don't know. Like, at the moment, this man is like, he's very early on in his journey of learning anything. He doesn't know. He doesn't know anything more than the basic facts that happened to him. He doesn't know who Jesus is. He doesn't know why this happened. He doesn't understand. All he's saying is sharing the story of what happened to him. So at this point, he's taken to the Pharisees. And there it says in verse 14, it says, Jesus had made the mud and it was a Sabbath. So verse 15, therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied. So this is the fact then that the Pharisees jump on this idea. Verse 16, some of the Pharisees say, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. Now, the only thing that Jesus did that breaks the Sabbath there is making mud. And so that's their complaints, their upsetness with Jesus, that he's gone away and broken the Sabbath by breaking their man-made rules. But then it says there, obviously, but some people are not so sure. Verse 16, how can a sinner perform such signs? And they were still divided at this point. It's interesting that there's no one that's sort of celebrating the miracle. There's no one that's celebrating this man and his sight. They're busy analyzing whether Jesus is someone that can be accepted or is not accepted. So then verse 17, they turn again to the blind man. What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened. Now, this is the first step in this man's journey. He says he is a prophet. So at first he's like, I don't know. Now he's saying, oh, actually, no, he must be a prophet. So this man is starting to piece together the ideas that he's had, and he's starting to build a picture in his head, and he's now coming on this journey of working out who Jesus is and what Jesus means in his life. But then they still don't believe him, and they go to the parents. And this is an interesting thing because the parents are like, well, yes, he's my son, but no, we don't know anything about it. Let him speak for himself. And there's this note there, verse 22, where it says his parents said this because they were afraid that they would be put out of the synagogue. Now, that might not sound like a big deal to you. If you were kicked out of church, you'd be like, oh, well, never mind, and you'd probably carry on about their daily lives. But in that culture, Judaism was built into the entire fabric of society. And in the same way that, like, for example, that Jews were not allowed to talk to non-Jews. So, I mean, we see these examples when we think, for example, the Samaritan woman at the well, the Jews weren't even allowed to talk to her. Or, you know, when the Good Samaritan comes across the man who'd been beaten up, once again, like it was completely unacceptable to talk to, if you were a Jew. If you're kicked out of the synagogue, you lose your social standing, you lose your community, you lose all the people who used to be your friends are now no longer your friends, because they're not allowed to talk to you because you're not a good Jew anymore. So it was a massive threat to their identity, to who they were as people, and they were afraid. They hadn't had an encounter with Jesus at this point. They weren't willing to stand up to the authorities. And even though they'd seen a great miracle in their son, they were like, no, not even, no, they deferred the situation. And so they go back to the man again. And once again, they're asking about the mud. Look at verse 26 again. What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? They're basically trying to get this man to say again, oh, he made mud, right? Because they want to I guess, get him to incriminate Jesus. Verse 24 is a very interesting one there too. When they summon the man, it says, give glory to God by telling the truth. So this is an equivalent in our culture of, you know, they would say, give glory to God by telling the truth. It's like saying, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. This was like almost their legal clause that said, this is the truth. You must tell the truth. And look, they've clearly made up their minds by here in verse 24. They say, we know this man is a sinner. So the Pharisees are now fixed in their opinion. They're not still deciding. They know, they are convinced Jesus is not the Messiah. This man, he's still on a journey. He's figuring it out. He doesn't know, which in a way, it means this story is a meta-narrative of the whole of the book of John. As I mentioned before, John is a story about encouraging anybody who gets to know Jesus to come to the conclusion that he's the Messiah. The Pharisees have made a decision already. We know he's a sinner. He's definitely not God. The man is still on his journey to make a decision. So anyway, verse 27, it's supposed to be a funny response, right? They've asked him like multiple times, and the man responds. He's got quite a lot of character. He's got a bit of cheek. I've told you already and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? And the use of the word too, I think, is interesting there, because it's sort of implying that this man has made the decision at this point. He wants to become one of the disciples. He's bought into this narrative. He's gone from he's a prophet to now he's inferring indirectly that he wants to be a disciple of Jesus. So anyway, they shout and they scream, and eventually, verse 34, they kick him out. When it says they threw him out, they're referring to throwing him out of the synagogue, which means that this man has gone from at least having a community but being blind to now having his sight but losing his community. He's lost all his friends, he's lost his network, he doesn't have his home and his family and his neighbors around him to support him like he did anymore. They've kicked him out, so he's lost everything. And that's why it's so important what Jesus goes and does. Jesus hears that they've thrown him out and goes to find him. And I really love this image because this man's never seen Jesus before. He was born blind, so he doesn't know who Jesus is. So Jesus comes up to him and he doesn't know who he is. And it's this beautiful picture of almost innocent naivety where the man is still trying to figure out, who is Jesus? Is he someone I can definitely trust? Where does Jesus fit in my life? And the man says in verse 34, who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him. So he's saying now, I want to buy in. I want to believe in this Son of Man. I want to know who this person is. And Jesus says, I am he. And then the response of the man is quite beautiful. In verse 38, the man says, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. The rest of the chapter carries on with a very interesting little exchange. Jesus says, verse 39, for judgment I have come into this world, so the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, what? Are we blind too? means they definitely recognized the metaphor that Jesus was playing at. They definitely saw that this is a story on two levels. It's a story about physical blindness, but more importantly, it's a story about spiritual blindness. It's a story that challenges the reader. Are you blind? Are we blind too? It's an important question, and I think it's the question we should ask as we leave this passage today. Remember, all these stories are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. These stories, they build on each other. You've got the miracle turning water into wine at Cana. You have the boy who was healed. You have the feeding of the 5,000. You have Jesus walking on the water. And all the way along, John is saying, have you decided yet? Have you decided yet? Have you made up your mind? Are we like the Pharisees? Have we already decided? Have we decided that Jesus is not the Messiah and we've closed the door to that as a possibility? Or maybe we, like the blind man, are still on this journey of discovery into who Jesus is. And that's okay. The book of John isn't finished yet. There's more chapters to continue to build the narrative as we come on a journey to see who Jesus is. Or maybe you have made that decision already. Maybe you read this story and you see this, that Jesus is the Messiah, and you see this as a beautiful work of recreation that God has done in this man who was born in a state of brokenness. I believe that Jesus can do that same recreation in our lives today. He's the same Jesus that formed Adam from the dust of the ground in Genesis 1. He's the same man that spit on the ground and used a visceral means to heal this man's sight. And he can also take our own pain and our brokenness and heal that in our lives in 2020 in Melbourne. Maybe this is the story that makes you say, wow, Jesus is the Christ. I believe. And then we, like the man in the story, will worship him.